Eta lehen, hizlaria aurkezteko unea da. Oso gaztea bada ere, bizitza bat baino gehiago bizi izan duela iradokitzen du bere ibilbide profesionalak. Crowdsourcing delakoaren inguruan mundu mailako aditua da, eta bere ikuspegia, bere gomendioak eta bere laguntza maiz eskatzen dute askotariko nazioarteko erakundek, Nazio Batuen erakundea berak, OCDEek eta baita etxe zuriak berak ere. Tanja Aitamurto es doctora en filosofía, es investigadora postdoctoral en el equipo de democracia de Crowdsourcing de la Escuela de Ingeniería de la Universidad de Stanford, donde examina, diseña e implementa nuevas tecnologías para medios, para informar, para empoderar y para conectar a las personas. El impacto sobre el comportamiento humano y la sociedad del crowdsourcing, la realidad virtual y aumentada y la inteligencia artificial aplicada al periodismo y a los procesos democráticos son algunas de las líneas de su trabajo, de su actual trabajo, porque antes de centrarse en esta labor académica, Tanja trabajó también como periodista especializada en asuntos militares y de defensa, informando desde países en conflictos como Afganistán, Angola y Uganda. To be honest, introducing such an impressive lady is not easy. We are really very happy that you're here, Tanja. Thank you very much. And the stage is for you. Thank you.
So let's start from the beginning. Good morning, Egunon, and thanks a lot for having me here. It's a great pleasure and honor. It's my first time in the Basque Country, and it's a country that I've always wanted to visit, so I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm really much enjoying the experience. It's very positive. People are very friendly. There's so much to see and learn about the great culture and language here, so thank you. And I will talk today about crowdsourced policymaking, focusing on three different aspects. Namely, we're going to talk about definition and process, how crowdsourced policymaking works. And then we're going to talk about what motivates the crowd's motivation factors to participate. And then we're going to look into what type of value does crowdsourced policymaking create, and also what type of challenges there may be. So let's start from the definition. So what is crowdsourcing really? And how we define crowdsourcing is that it's an open task online for anybody to participate in. So it's a problem-solving exercise. So the crowdsourcer posts tasks online, and then anybody who is willing to participate can participate by submitting ideas and comments and so on. And the locus of the power in crowdsourcing is always within the crowdsourcer. So if a city government, for instance, the city of Bilbao, would use crowdsourcing in any of their policymaking efforts, it would be then the city government, the elected representatives, who would still make the decisions. So the crowd would participate, but the decision-making power is still within the crowdsourcer. As opposed to some other online collaboration methods like common-based peer production, which has less hierarchy, and then there the commons, the participants, can create things collaboratively and put those into action by themselves. And I'll give you more examples soon about crowdsourced policymaking. And why do we use crowdsourcing in policymaking then? It is because we want to activate citizens between the elections. So we want to have active and informed citizenry, not only every 4 years when there's time for elections, but we want to have active citizens and residents at all times. And that's how crowdsourcing works as a democratic innovation. And what we mean by democratic innovations is that democratic innovations are practices and methods and tools that bring citizens closer to decision-making processes beyond established practices like voting every 4 years in elections. And now let's go deeper into looking into practice. How does crowdsourcing work? And for that, let's travel to my home country, which is Finland, a small country up north by the Arctic Circle. And let's look at a couple of examples from there first. In the first example, it's very much related to snow. So in Finland, we have snow most of the year round. I know here in Basque Country, you also have some snow in the mountains, so you might be familiar with that. But you may not be riding around with your snowmobiles like we do in Finland because we have so much snow. And we meet here Jaska who is an active snowmobile rider because he lives in a very remote village just by the Arctic Circle. You see that red line over there. So that's where he lives. And he lives in a remote village, so he uses his snowmobile in the winter to ride around, to go to post office. Also, he uses his snowmobile to herd his reindeer. He has some reindeer there. But Jaska, like many other Finnish people, he's not very happy how and where and when he can ride his snowmobile. And so he's not happy with the law, the policy that governs snowmobile riding. So in Finland, we have a law called off-road traffic law. And this law regulates all the traffic that happens beyond established roads. So any traffic that happens in the nature, in the paths, and so on, whether it's in the winter or in the summer. And this law is pretty outdated, and there has been a lot of complaints that there should be more work put into this law, and it should be updated to this date. This law has two main goals. It should protect the nature from the harm that off-road traffic, like snowmobile riding or ATV riding in the summer, can cause, and also it should, of course, protect the safety of people using off-road traffic vehicles. So then, at the time, our Ministry of the Environment, Mr. Ville Niinistö, he decided that, okay, let's now reform the law. Let's do it, but let's do it in a new way. Let's involve the citizens in a lawmaking process. So let's use crowdsourcing in the policymaking process. And this was governed in the Finnish newspapers. It was the first time that crowdsourcing was used in any lawmaking process, so there were a lot of press coverage about the topic. And what the crowdsourcing meant in practice was that we set up an online platform where there was more information about the law. People could go and read, okay, what is this law about? What is the pressure? Why should it be reformed? And so on, how many snowmobile riders there are, and so on. And then people were asked to submit their ideas how to improve the law. And there were 10 different categories that the government defined together with our research group. So I participated in this project by designing and implementing the process as a pioneering case in Finland doing crowdsourced policymaking. And so there were 10 categories that the government asked the citizens to submit ideas for. For instance, safety, protecting the nature, age limits for riding snowmobile. So all these categories came from the law. What is this law about, and what type of categories are emerging from this law? And then people would submit their ideas by writing their idea on this online forum and then submitting it online. And then the ideas would pop up here on the platform. Other people could comment on those. They could vote those up and down. Sorry, these are in Finnish, not translated into Basque language yet. So this was one case, the crowdsourced off-road traffic law case. And after that, we have had several similar cases in the national and local government in Finland. So for instance, the Ministry of Justice decided to use crowdsourcing in reforming limited liability housing company law, which sounds a very complicated and boring sounding law, but it's actually a very relevant law because it governs how every apartment building is managed. So if you own an apartment in Finland in any apartment building, or if you are a tenant in any apartment building, you are governed by this law. So it touches about 3 million people, and in Finland we have only 5 million people, so most of the people are affected. And what happened in this case again, so the Ministry of Justice asked people to send in their ideas and comments about how this law should be reformed, like in terms of certain topics that the government had defined based on earlier feedback and so on. And they got a lot of different ideas, and then those were analyzed and synthesized to the policy reform. Then another third case, this is from California, from Palo Alto, which is a pretty small town, about less than 100,000 people living next to Stanford University, my employer. And there, the city of Palo Alto crowdsourced people's ideas for their comprehensive city plan. So comprehensive city plan is like a master plan for the city for the next 15 years. So it defines all important elements, for instance, what will the city be doing in terms of reforming transportation issues? There's massive traffic jams every day, so how will the city resolve those? How about housing issues? How about public services and this and that? And now, for the first time, the city of Palo Alto decided to involve all the residents online, and also there were offline activities, large-scale summits, and so on. And how this process worked, it had this open call crowdsourcing. In the beginning, people were able to send in their ideas how to resolve issues with transportation. And then also, the city government took that input, channeled it to the policy, revised the policy, and then they published the new policy draft online. And the residents were invited to annotate the draft. As you can see here, some words are underlined, some are highlighted, some are removed. So these all are annotations that show what has happened to the policy, what has been changed. And now people were asked to add their ideas here and also ask questions about the law, about the policy. So what's really common now, as we can see to all these cases, the two Finnish ones, and then now this Palo Alto Comprehensive City Plan case, we see that there's a process that starts with involving the crowd, it's crowdsourcing. Then there's analysis and synthesis, so that's when the civil servants in the national or local government, they take the crowd's input, they analyze and synthesize it, they channel it into policy, they draft a new version of the policy. Then again, there can be a crowdsourcing moment when that policy draft is published online, and then the crowd is invited to participate again, and then again, the crowd's input is analyzed and synthesized, and then channeled to the policy. And so the cycle continues until the policy is ready and accepted by the elected representatives. So now let's take a step back and think about how does crowdsourcing fit into our traditional policymaking processes? What does it change? So let's think about a typical lawmaking process in Finland. So how that works is that we have the parliament, which consists of elected representatives who are elected every 4 years by elections. And then we have the government, who are members of the parliament, who are the ministries. Then we have the civil servants, who are the legal drafters. And they can work there. They are not elected representatives, so they are hired bureaucrats, like they can work there 20 years, regardless when the government changes. So they are legal drafters, they are experts in these policies. So it's their job to draft their bills. So they can be commissioned by the parliament or the government who says that, okay, now we need to reform this law. So the civil servants take that from the Ministry of the Environment, for instance, and start revising the policy. They work with interest groups. They work with experts committee if they decide to set up one. And when the bill is ready, it goes to the parliament, and the parliament either can accept it, reject it, or ask it to be revised. The parliament has the final decision-making power about any laws. Just like in a city level and the local government level, it would be the city council where the elected representatives have the final decision-making power, for instance, in the Palo Alto case about the comprehensive city plan. So now, let's bring the crowd in. We see the crowd here as this huge balloon on the background. So the crowd brings in an additional data point to the lawmaking, to the policymaking process. So the civil servants still draft the bill, as they always do. They work, they get information from elsewhere. They use consultants, interest groups, expert committee, and so on. The crowd is one additional data point. And then when the bill is ready, it again goes to the parliament, who has the final decision-making power. So what changes in this process when we bring the crowd in is that the civil servants can get additional information from the crowd. But it doesn't change who makes the actual decision about the policy. And why the crowd is such a huge yellow balloon on the background, kind of undefined, little bit ambiguous, is that the crowd typically is anonymous. We don't know who they are. So they can be anybody, any of you. They could be civil servants, they could be parliament members, well, rarely they are, but we don't identify who they are. So that's why it's not one separated, isolated entity, but it can be really anybody. So now it's important to remember we have been talking about what crowdsourcing is, but let's talk about what it's not. So it's not a decision-making tool for direct democracy. So as we saw here, the parliament, the elected representatives still have the decision-making power. But still, so we have other methods for direct democracy, like participatory budgeting, referenda, where the citizens or the residents can decide directly about the city budget, for instance, how a part of a city budget is allocated, or national referenda about certain policy measure should a country join other, for instance, in Finland there's always talk about should there be a referendum organized about whether Finland should join NATO or not. But crowdsourcing is not about that. Crowdsourcing is a tool to get ideas and feedback, comments from the crowd. But then crowdsourcing is not an opinion poll. It's not a public opinion poll. It's not about asking what would the city, let's say, take an example from Bilbao here, that the city of Bilbao would like to know whether residents of Bilbao would like to have a new hospital or a new school. A hospital or a school. So crowdsourcing is not a good method to ask people, would you like to have a new hospital or a new school? Because crowdsourcing is always based on self-selection, so it's biased towards people who are already interested in these topics. Whereas if you want to have a public opinion poll, you should use traditional methods that we use in political science and social science, random sampling, calling people, yes or no, do you want to have a school or hospital, and so on. Also, crowdsourcing is a method in an earlier stage in a policymaking process where we don't yet have those two options, school or hospital, which are kind of binary choices, not a good example in that sense, but just using it here to illustrate my point. So crowdsourcing brings in, so you start a crowdsourcing process with a question, how could we improve our education system? Instead of providing an option to the crowd already that we need a new school. Whereas in a public opinion poll, you use it in the point where you already have those options. You get the difference, right? So when we think about then crowdsourcing in the policymaking cycle, so how we typically conceptualize policymaking is that it's a cycle that goes through certain stages. So first there's a problem that's defined. For instance, in Finland the problem was we need more efficient policies to govern off-road traffic because there's more of that and there might be more harm to the nature and also there's safety issues and this and that. Then there needs to be data gathering so that there's more information about these options. Then we need to develop options, we need to consult experts, the crowd, for instance, and then there's designing and drafting the bill, decision-making, implementation, and then evaluation. And what we see here is that those boxes that are highlighted in red, so those are very conducive to the crowd's participation. So the crowd can well participate in defining the problem. What is that, for instance, here in the Basque Country, if you wanted to reform your education system, if there was a need to improve the education system, you could ask the crowd to participate and start from an open-ended question, how should we reform our education system? Let's map problems first. Then you define the problem more closely, gather data, develop options, and go through the whole process, and the crowd can participate through evaluating these options and the actual implemented law too. But the crowd is less often part of the actual drafting the law or the policy. It does happen in some cases, but it's less rare. The crowd doesn't decide about the policy, as I already said, and the crowd doesn't implement the law or the policy because it's the role and the job of the government to do policy implementation. So that was the first section of my talk, and I'll just check my time. Yes. So now I hope that we are on the same page about, you have an idea of what crowdsourcing in policymaking is, how it can look like based on the 3 cases that I showed, and also what crowdsourcing is not, like what it is not, where it's not good to use crowdsourcing. And now in this second part, I want to show more deeply what the experience of participation to the citizens are. So what does it mean for a crowd member to actually participate in a crowdsourced lawmaking process? So we're going to talk about the profile of the participant crowd and their motivation factors. So who participates and why? So this is what the two questions that this section will address. So we're going to go back to Jaska, our Finnish participant who lives very close to the Arctic Circle, and he participated really actively in this crowdsourced off-road traffic law project by using his small tablet device. So what we wanted to do in our studies when we wanted to understand the crowd's experience better was to understand people's like Jaska's political participation, what does it mean to vote in elections as compared to participating crowdsourcing experiences and so on, so that we could define better ways and design better processes and also technologies for crowdsourced policymaking. So when we look at the participant profile, like who are the people who participate, and we look at the demographic information that we have gathered through surveys to the people who participate, so we see that it's mostly educated men. It's 60 to 80% across these cases that I mentioned. But there's age distribution. This was somewhat surprising to us that the age distribution varies, because the expectation, the assumption that there typically is that any online process you have, it's going to be mostly young people and not the old people for multiple reasons. But no, the age distribution varies. Also, senior people participate. Like we see from the statistics from the limited liability housing company law case, 42% of the participants were 65-year-old or more. And one might ask, whereas in the off-road traffic law case, it was less than that. It was about 30, 30, 30. So it was more evenly distributed across the main age groups. And of course, there's a natural explanation why that is. Why in the housing company law case, there were more senior people who participated? Well, it's more senior people who own apartments in Finland. The more senior you are, the more wealth you have, so the more likely you are to buy apartments and to have property. And of course, people who own property worth millions of euros or even 200,000 euros, they are more interested in participating to reforming the law that actually affects their property value. That makes sense. So the point that I'm making here is that the profile of the crowd, in one way, it replicates this typical participation patterns that we see in elections. So it's the more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote in elections. So the more educated you are, you're more likely to participate in crowdsourced policymaking. Also, if you're a man, so you're more likely to participate. But also then there are a mixed bag. It's not only these usual suspects, as we call them. There are a mix of demographic factors who come to participate. And also the same thing replicates here when we have, when we look at civic activities. So how often people participate in other types of civic activities than crowdsourced policymaking. So we see that we have a very active, the participant group is often very active online. Like we see 72% of the people had already been writing on online forums and had been active there, and now they also participated in crowdsourced policymaking. And also, there are people who are active in civic activities in general. They write newspaper opinion pieces, opinion editorials. They contact their local MPs, their local representatives or members of the parliament. They sign online petitions and so on. But you see that not everybody is like that. It's only 33% who have written op-eds or contacted their members of the parliament. The rest, 70%, haven't. So we get a mixed bag of participants in terms of their civic activity. And why do we care about this? Is that because crowdsourcing is supposed to be one of these democratic innovations that has the potential to activate people who are not that active societally in general. So the more we can activate people who are more in the margins, who are not actively speaking up and being part of political processes, the better it is for all of us, because we want to really hear the opinions and ideas of those who are not usually heard. And now let's talk about the motivation factors. What actually drives the crowd? Like, why does the crowd want to participate in crowdsourced policymaking? And we have done several studies about this, and we identify these 7 different factors. The first one, improving the law. So the crowd simply wants to participate because they want to have a better law, and they see their participation as an avenue for doing that. They want to solve problems in the law. They want to learn about the law. They want to discuss the topic. They are interested in others' viewpoints. They also have this more ideological thinking that they want to represent citizens' views, so they think it's important that they show up on the platform and submit their ideas and comments so that the citizens would be represented too. And finally, there's altruistic motivations, this type of civic duty, thinking that it's my duty to protect the nature. If the law is about nature, like the off-road traffic law, has this nature protection element to it. So we see that these 7 motivation factors are an interplay of epistemic. Epistemic means knowledge producing, so related to knowledge. So there are interplay of knowledge-related and social aspects. So people want to share their knowledge, their ideas. They also want to learn from others, and they are interested in others' viewpoints. And why we care about this is because the better we understand what drives the crowd, the better we can design the processes so that we can motivate a broad range of people to participate. And when we think about these motivation factors on a continuum that has 2 binary options or descriptors at the end. So extrinsic motivation factors that are factors that drive our participation for some tangible outcome. In this case, most of the motivation factors are extrinsic, meaning people participate because they want to have a better law. They want to solve issues that they have in their housing company or they experience with off-road traffic. They also want to discuss with others, and they are interested in others' viewpoints, not because they are social in general, it's because they want to learn more about the law and they want to find better ways to influence the law. So these are all procedural, like they're instrumental for them to gain what they want to have, which is improve the law in a certain way. Also, learning is an extrinsic factor because the participants want to learn, because they want to know much more about the law so that they could change it the most efficient way. Whereas then, intrinsic factors are factors that motivate us because those are like internal motivations and we don't expect some tangible outcome. For instance, sociotropic and altruistic reasons like civic duty, we need to represent citizens' views, so that's not leading to a certain type of a goal, but it's just an end in itself. Those are intrinsic motivation factors. And when we think about the evolution of motivation factors, what happens during crowdsourcing, we did a study where we were able to measure the participants' motivation factors in the beginning of a crowdsourcing process. So when people signed up on the online platform, they got a survey asking about what motivates you to come here, so before they even participated, only when they registered on the platform. And we provided them several options. And then we measured the motivation factors once again during the process, and then third time after the process was over. So there were 3 data points for us points in the time when we measured the motivation factors. And what we found was that most of the motivation factors, they declined, so they became weaker during the process. So resolving issues, improving the law, discussing the topic, and interest in others' viewpoints, they started from really high scores, and then they went down during the process. And one might ask, why is that? Why is that happening? Well, it's related to this saturation point that we identified in the crowd's activity. So what we see in this graph is the number of ideas the crowd produced during 2 crowdsourcing sequences. So here's one crowdsourcing sequence, and here's a second crowdsourcing sequence, or crowdsourcing stages. And we see that the number of ideas goes up here in the first stage in a week. So this axis is weeks. So there were 8 weeks altogether in the first part of the process, and in week 5 it goes up, and then it goes drastically down. In the second crowdsourcing process, we had 7 weeks, and then the number of ideas starts from high in the beginning. There's another peak in week number 6, and then it goes down again. And why is that? Well, of course, all processes have a beginning and an end. And what happens here in crowdsourcing is that reality strikes the participants. So after they have participated a certain amount of time, whether it's 6 weeks or 5 weeks, they understand that, okay, this is actually a more complex issue that I thought about in the beginning. So when they come to the platform, they have never participated in crowdsourced policymaking before because it's a novel process and there's no other processes like that out there typically. So it's the first time they come to the platform and they don't know what to expect. And what they think is that, okay, I'm going to submit my idea here and that's that. But then the more the time goes on and other people submit their ideas too, they see that, oh, there's so much diversity. There's so many other ideas and so many other viewpoints. This is lawmaking, policymaking is much more complicated than I thought. So that's what I mean by reality strikes. Policymaking is not as simple as you might think, as a lay person might think. I'm sure you know as civil servant, public servants, that policymaking is oftentimes a compromise of many different viewpoints. So that's what the participants are learning. So, but then there was one motivation factor that remained constant throughout the crowdsourcing time. So it didn't decline at all, it didn't decrease. And that was learning. So the learning was a strong motivation factor in the beginning, it was during the process, and at the end. And what we can learn from here is that, first of all, how we defined learning here was that we did interviews with the participants and asked about the learning aspect when we got these survey results. And we learned that the learning happens both in peer learning, so it happens when the participants talk with each other, communicate with each other on the platforms, they learn from each other's comments, and they also learn from the experts. So in these cases where the public servants were present on the platform and people were able to ask questions and the experts answered, so that's what we call expert learning. And as one of the participants said in an interview when we asked about learning, like, could you tell more about how did you learn on the platform? So she said that, I learned about practices in housing companies in other parts of the country and about issues and solutions elsewhere. Everybody can then compare their own housing company situation to others and learn from that. So this quote shows how this kind of small act of participation opens up this window of other people's experiences, other people's viewpoints to the same topic. So then what we can take away from this motivation factor findings that I just presented is that if we want to sustain participation in crowdsourced policymaking, we should invest a lot in designing processes and platforms that support learning. So both peer learning, from participant to participant, and also learning from experts. And then you might think, well, you know, a lot of these motivation factors were declining. Isn't that a negative thing? Like, that must be a failure or, you know, unsuccessful process. But no, that's actually natural. If we think about how, let's say here we had an offline brainstorming moment about ideas how to improve transportation in the city of Bilbao. So what would likely happen in that, in the first half an hour, we would all be really active presenting ideas. We would get hundreds of ideas. After that 30 minutes, our activity would go down, and that means that it's time to move on. It's time to take the input, analyze and synthesize it, and then move on to the next step in the process. And that's why it's important to remember that when we design crowdsourcing processes, there's always a beginning and an end, and you want to have it as a pretty short stage campaign, like a process, where there are a lot of points for participation for people so that they can participate in different points of the policy-making cycle, so that even if they miss the first the crowdsourcing moment, they can participate later in the process. But you don't have like a 6-month-long or year-long crowdsourcing process where somebody participates now and only a year from now you start to analyze the input. No, that's too slow, and the motivation factors will just continue going down. So this was the second part of this talk about the motivation factors and the profile of the crowd. So let's check on the time. We still have some time. Okay, great. So I will be able to go through the final part of my talk, which is now about value and challenges in crowdsourced policymaking, and we'll start from value. And this is a framework that we designed. It's an aspirational framework, which means that crowdsourcing in policymaking has the potential to create value in 3 different ways, but it's aspirational in the sense that it doesn't necessarily happen. So this shows the potential, and there are multiple ways how we can actually then harness that potential. And these 3 different aspects are democratic value, epistemic, that means knowledge-producing value, and then economic value. And when we start with the democratic value, so we can divide it into transparency, accountability, deliberation, and empowerment. And in terms of transparency and accountability, what happens in crowdsourced policymaking is that we have 2 types of transparency. We have first horizontal transparency, which means the transparency between the crowd members. Because on the platform, anybody can see each other's ideas and comments, and they can comment on each other's ideas and comments too. And then there's vertical transparency. There's transparency from the government to the crowd, to the residents or citizens. So that means that the government sees what the crowd is saying, what the crowd is doing on the platform. And also there's transparency from the crowd to the government, meaning that the crowd sees now, oh, the government is planning on reforming this law, and that's the directions they might be taking. Or this law, now there was this crowdsourcing effort 2 months ago, we wonder what's the status of this process. And that, of course, increases the possibility for the participants in the crowd to contact the government and ask for updates, and also demand accountability, that the government can't just hide their plans and decisions because the crowd has been part of the process. So there has to be that feedback loop, and there has to be updates to the crowd about the participants, what's going on with the process. And the third value creation point is deliberation. And what we mean by deliberation here is that it's an reasoned exchange of arguments in a discussion or in online conversation. And where deliberation happens in crowdsourced policymaking is in these comments that people leave for each other's ideas and how they comment on each other's comments, so in that interactive process. And why we care about deliberation, that comes from democratic theory. The idea is that the more people deliberate about societal issues, the more informed and active citizenry we have, because we have to think about others' viewpoints, we have to formulate our own opinions and gather information. So it's considered to be good to all of us the more we deliberate. And there's also learning, because people, as we saw in my previous section of this talk, that there is learning happening when people communicate with each other on this platform. And of course, one big question about deliberation is that, so how good quality is deliberation on online platforms then? Because oftentimes, when we think about online interactions, we might think about YouTube comments, something that's not very high quality. People are just yelling at each other and being very inappropriate. So the question is, to what extent does that happen in crowdsourced policymaking? So we studied that by using very demanding criteria from democratic deliberation theory, and we found that the quality of deliberation is actually surprisingly good in crowdsourced policymaking. So the tone is neutral or positive, so there's very little negative or aggressive tones, and people are very constructive. They respect each other's opinions, and they also they are interactive, so they show attention and interest in others' viewpoints too. So, and why is that? You might think, well, why is that? Why is it that on YouTube people are inappropriate, but why on crowdsourced policymaking that's not the case? And one reason for that may be that in all the cases that I've been involved in and I've studied are officially run by the government. So it's a city government or a national government who sets up the platform, officially informs about people, now you can please come and participate, let's do this policymaking, reform this policy together. So the participants, they really value that option. They take an honor, they take a pride of their participation. So they want to be constructive, they want to have meaningful contributions. So that's one reason. And also, of course, there's moderation on these platforms. If there is something inappropriate, it will be removed actively. So there's no space for, it's not like if you think about gardening and you would just throw some seeds there and let them grow and it grows into this wild bush. No, it's in the crowdsourcing process, you have to actively maintain your garden and be sure that if there are participants who are continuously misbehaving, so we send them messages and say, hey, look, we noticed that your previous comments was quite negative. Would you mind revising it, or in 24 hours we have to remove it? And that's how you show participants that there's somebody listening. It's not like on YouTube that you can leave comments and nobody even reads that. But no, this is a serious process. And then the fourth value creation point is empowerment of citizens. And what I mean by this is this very profound feeling that some participants described when we asked how did it feel to participate in crowdsourced policymaking. Like one of the participants said in an interview that this is actually the first time in my lifetime when I feel that I'm really participating in making democracy and influencing decision-making in this society. It feels much more real than just voting for some person. So this participant was a Finnish person who had voted in every election since he was 18 years old. We consider him as a pretty active member of civil society. And still participating in this pretty small online crowdsourcing effort, leaving a couple of comments and ideas there, reading, maybe using a couple of hours reading other people's comments and input on the platform, it created this type of a impact on him that he says that it feels much more real than just voting for some person. So this is what I mean by citizen empowerment. And this is what these type of democratic innovations can create, this type of feeling of the citizens feel that they are part of a policymaking process, they are really listened to, and their voice actually matters. And this brings us back to Jaska, this very active participant who participated in the crowdsourced off-road traffic law case, and he lives in a remote village, so for him, participating in other political activities is pretty hard because he would need to drive his car really far away, and there's no time and so on. So what we see here is that crowdsourcing also empowers citizens by bringing access to policymaking processes psychologically, like mentally. Crowdsourcing makes the distance to policymaking and democratic decision-making smaller. It makes the distance shorter, but also geographically, like practically, that distance becomes shorter. Because, for instance, one of the participants we interviewed, he said that the only way to make a difference from out here in the country is really online. All other activity means you have to drive around in your car or evening to get somewhere. It's pretty impossible. So there are a lot of areas in Finland where there's very sparse population, so people live far apart from each other, and really participating in any political activities that you would need to travel to southern Finland where the capital is, or then you would need to go to some municipal meetings that can be really far away from your home. But now with crowdsourcing, they can participate from their own couch or by their kitchen table. And then the second value creation point is this knowledge-producing value that we mentioned earlier already. So people share and produce knowledge on this online platform, and this knowledge is situated knowledge, it's experience-based knowledge. That means that the people who participate in crowdsourced policymaking, they share their experiences about off-road traffic law in practice or living in housing companies in practice, what these problems may be. Of course, there's also the traditional expertise-based knowledge, meaning that there are experts like lawyers, activists who are on this platform who cite other laws in other countries and put in links that, oh, look, in Sweden or Norway, this off-road traffic law is governed this way, why wouldn't we use this as an example? So it's a mixture of different types of knowledge that can make policy making much more rich and diverse. And this is how crowdsourced policymaking turns into a method to harness collective intelligence. Collective intelligence is this notion of that the more diverse the crowd is and the larger the participant group, the more likely the solution can be better in many aspects than if it was only a homogeneous group of experts small group of experts who would decide the solution. And that's what we are trying to do in our work, is that we are trying to harness those two virtues of collective intelligence, diversity and large crowd, and channel that into policymaking in meaningful ways. And finally, the third value creation point is economic value. And the idea here is that now with these online methods, the government can access people's problems and needs much faster and cost efficiently online, so they can get much more information in a short period of time that they could ever do by calling people, asking them to come into town hall meetings. And this is how we can harness something that's called the crowd capital, as some colleagues have defined it. And that can lead to more efficient service delivery by the government, because now the government has more information about the problems, they can define the problem better, and also come up with better solutions. So now, finally, I have some time, about 5 minutes, to conclude with some challenges. So obviously now we have learned that what crowdsourced policymaking is, why the people participate, what the potential value is. But of course, there's challenges, and there's many of them, as we have touched upon earlier in this talk. So I'm going to focus on one main challenge, which is the analysis and synthesis of the crowdsourced input, which we call the civic data overload, and I'll explain what it is. I'll explain it by using an example. So now let's travel to California, to the city of Palo Alto, who is crowdsourcing their comprehensive city plan. And we have here Hilary Gittelman, who is an urban planner in the city of Palo Alto, and she's one of the leading directors of the comprehensive city plan process. And she's pretty happy in the picture, as we can see, and she's happy because people participate so actively. There's many ideas and comments about how to improve transportation, and that's great, that's what she wants. But at the same time, what that means is that she has these piles of spreadsheet full of different types of comments, which she has to process it. And it's unstructured data, which means that it's open-ended. You know, some comments are long, some comments are short. It's all text. It's not quantifiable in any way. So that means that it leads to this civic data overload, as we call it. So the poor, the civil servants, the urban planners are drowning into this data. So they are really happy that people participate, but at the same time, there's so much data for them to process, so they don't know what to do with it. And this is what we call the paradox of participation. And what we mean by paradox of participation is that when you have the situation that we want people to participate actively, but at the same time, the active participation causes challenges. And here we have this bottleneck where the poor civil servant is trying to pull out the cork from the bottle to get the citizens' input and make some meaningful synthesis out of it, but there's lack of analysis tools to actually do that. So, and what this creates a situation where, let's say we have a crowdsourced policymaking process, people participate actively, and then there's so much of that data, and the city government just then ignores it because they were not, when they designed the process, they were not prepared to think about how to actually process the citizens' input. So they just push it aside. So it's the same situation if in an election we all voted really actively, but then our votes were not counted. So you can imagine how it feels for the participants when they ask from the city government or the national government a couple of months later, so what did you do? I spent 5 hours on this platform and left 100 comments. What happened to those? It's like, well, it's somewhere in the archives. We don't know what happened. But this is a design challenge only. We have to think about this when we start designing crowdsourced policymaking processes, that, okay, so if we get 100 ideas, how do we analyze that? Well, not a problem. Human resources, easy to categorize. There's systems for that. It's not complicated. How about if we get 1,000? How about if we get 10,000? What are we going to do then? Do we have, for instance, in local university, are there research groups who could help, like we have been helping out in many of these processes? So how do we do that? One method that we have been testing out is artificial intelligence. So what we wanted to see is how artificial intelligence tools like natural language processing and machine learning, how could that automated, at least partially automated analysis of this crowdsourced input could help in analyzing and synthesizing the crowdsourced citizen comments. And so we developed this tool. It's called Civic Crowd Analytics. It's in a prototype mode, so we use sentiment analysis and categorization so that there is a platform where the city government can go or anybody who wants to analyze a crowdsourced input, they can upload their commentary, they can choose how they want to have it analyzed. Let's say they want to see what type of categories emerge from the data that's about public transportation, and they see, oh, there's 97 ideas about public transit, 136 about non-motor power transit, so that's pedestrians and bicycles, and when they click on this, so they see the actual ideas and so on. So this is already helpful to see that how many ideas there were about certain topics, but you still need human resources to go through the ideas and actually pull out what are people then proposing about public transit. Are they saying more public shuttles or more buses or more bus lanes or this and that? So what we have learned so far, because there's a lot of hype about artificial intelligence, so I wanted to just share a few insights from the work that we have now, is that, yes, these can be great tools. However, it's not like a panacea, like a holy grail that will solve all this analysis and synthesis challenge. It has to be still very clearly planned ahead when you do crowdsourced policymaking. That could you somehow help people to structure their ideas when they're submitting the idea so that it would be easy for you and your colleagues to then analyze it later on, and so on. But also, then there's issues with machine learning and natural language processing. You need to have large data sets. So this means thousands or tens of thousands of data units. Whereas in typical crowdsourcing processes, unless it's a large crowdsourcing process in a big country, you get maximum some thousands of ideas. So that's a small data set for any machine learning algorithm to process. So it's hard for you to find enough data to train your algorithm and then actually use it. But we could maybe help this issue if we had more international collaboration and actually would then share our trained algorithms with each other, so that if City of Bilbao was to use crowdsourcing in improving their transportation policies, we have done already that in the city of Palo Alto, we could share the data and our algorithms for doing that. So now, just to conclude, well, I just want to show a couple of these ideas. What the challenge comes from is that here's one idea about public transportation. You see that it's not very long. There's a couple of sentences. There's actually 1, 2, 3 sentences, 4 sentences. But there's 4 different ideas there. So for you to actually analyze it as a human resource, you can easily take these and separate these ideas to different lines on a spreadsheet. But to do this by any automated method, so you have to train your algorithm to actually analyze each sentence and pull out all these ideas separately, because there's so many different ideas. And how about an idea like this? This is for the same process, how to improve transportation. So it's a lot of text, and it even continues. It didn't all fit to the slide. But there's also still just 4 ideas. So you see the diversity and what the challenge is for any technology to automate the analysis is. But so now I'm going to conclude, so we stay on time. So what we saw today, we had 3 parts in this talk. So we first learned what crowdsourced policymaking is. We saw some cases, how it can be used, how the process looks like. Then we talked about the crowd's motivation factors and their profile, why they participate. And then we spoke about the values of crowdsourced policymaking and the challenges that we have. So this was the main 3 main aspects that I wanted to share with you today, because I thought it has both practical implications and also it gives you some conceptual background, so that when you leave this room, you would know when somebody talks about crowdsourced policymaking, you could participate in the conversation and you would have your own opinions about it. So if you want to learn anything more, or if you want to see any of the research, all of this is based on the research that we have done in our team. So I have a website called thefinishexperiment.com. So all the publications are there, so you can go and download those publications and read more. And also I want to thank all the participants in Finland, in the United States, who have participated in this crowdsourced policymaking efforts, because without them, it wouldn't be possible. So the citizens, the participants are the key. And of course, all my co-authors and mentors. With this, thank you so much, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Tanja. It's been great.
Thank you. Can I just say, I wanted to say, this in Basque language to eskerrik asko. Thank you.
Eskerrik asko.
And also I wanted to say that if any of you want to do any crowdsourced policy making and would like to have any help, I would be happy to help. If it's from anybody, any organization with the Q-Epea organization or the city government or the national government, we have so much knowledge and experience, so we would be happy to share that. Thank you.
Eta ez da dudarik izango, egingo dugula. Eskerrik asko.